This is one of the Good Answers series, showing how the Bible is accurate and reliable. This topic, however, differs from most in the series in that it does not debunk any attack on the Scripture. Rather, it is an exciting account of how a dry spell in the weather produced a unique artifact from the time of Jesus. I must express thanks to Shelley Waxman, Inspector of Underwater Antiquities, who published his own first-person account of the excavation project. It was 1985 and 6 when Israel's Galilee had a drought, one lengthy enough to actually lower the level of the Sea of Galilee. The exposed mudflat sparked the interest of two amateur archaeologists who wondered what might have been exposed there. And sure enough, something was. They discerned in the mud the shape of a boat. Without disturbing it, they consulted Mendel Nun, who was known locally as a kinneretologist, that is, an expert on the Kinneret, as the Sea of Galilee is sometimes called. He knew the history, both written and oral, of the lake and events around it. He could not say whether the boat was ancient or not, but he did contact the Israeli Department of Antiquities. They sent their Inspector of Underwater Antiquities, Shelley Waxman. Waxman joined the group at the site, here on the northwestern shore of the Kinneret. He said they could test whether the boat was ancient by its construction. The ancient technique was to join the strakes, the long planks that form the outer hull, with mortise and tenon. They uncovered one strake and found that it showed unmistakable evidence of the ancient technique, and it was then the first ancient boat ever found at the Kinneret. Perhaps it came from the Jewish rebellion against Rome in the 60s AD, when they fought a naval engagement there. Amid this discussion, a sudden brief rainstorm hit, followed by this rainbow. Perhaps a good omen? They did some careful probes in the mud in hopes of getting a better sense of the find. That turned up a pot from outside the boat and a lamp from inside, both of them from around the 1st century. They replaced the mud, covered the site with flotsam and jetsam, and created two decoy sites to distract any who heard of the find. This would be an archaeological excavation to be done by the book, and that would take time. They planned to wait until the rising lake waters recovered the site, then set up and carry out a proper excavation. But somehow the secret leaked out, with speculation that this might be the very boat in which Jesus had sat when preaching to the crowd. Waxman laments, "The media hype was soon overwhelming. The Ministry of Tourism actively promoted the Jesus connection in the hope of drawing pilgrims to Israel. In Tiberias, ultra-Orthodox Jews, fearful that excavation of the boat would promote Christian missionary work, demonstrated against it." To make things worse, some had heard that in World War I, a Turkish boat carrying pay for the troops had been lost in the lake. The team would be forced to prepare for a dig under intense pressure from both the media and the excited public, and archaeology doesn't like to be rushed. Waxman again, "A proper excavation takes time to prepare. Funds must be raised, team members recruited, and a myriad of details worked out. Months and sometimes years go by before a planned excavation goes into the field. We would go into the field in 3 days. But they would first have to draft an excavation proposal and submit it to the authorities. They needed to consult the best expert on ancient boats, and he was in America. A quick plea to the U.S. Embassy in Israel for his airfare got him there post haste. And then the dry spell ended. It rained and rained, and the lake began to rise again, creeping from 100 feet away from the boat to just 30 feet. What to do? They wondered if they could lower the lake. It was possible. Israel's semi-arid climate made water from the lake valuable, and so 3 pumping and purification stations were in place. They operated only a few hours a day, but if they were run full-time, they might keep the level down. In any event, they had to begin. But seeing the activity around the site, a group from the nearest kibbutz showed up, claiming that the boat should be theirs. With help from police and the director of the Department of Antiquities, they were finally turned away, being reminded that all archaeological finds were government property. And work began, which they would be forced to continue day and night. They agreed to keep a 6-inch layer of mud over the wood for now to protect it. Using the pumping systems to lower the lake was denied, so the constant rain brought the water closer and closer to the dig. Day 2. The only other way they could find to protect the dig from flooding was to bring in bulldozers and form a dike around the site. Continued reporting about the boat from the media, which was now worldwide, was bringing in lots of volunteers to participate in the dig, and they came at it enthusiastically. Perhaps too enthusiastically for untrained help. Working like this produced trouble, and the stern of the boat broke. No more standing inside the boat. They rigged a suspended platform for the workers to lie on, as you see here. And as they began removing the protective layer of mud, everyone was warned, don't touch the wood. The next few days were extraordinarily tedious and still harrowing. The mud had to be sifted to make sure no small artifacts were missed. Once the wood was exposed, the strakes had to be outlined with care, and labels had to be placed on everything. Then, in case of disaster, they might be able to reassemble the parts. And of course, all this was being done by workers lying flat on a suspended platform. 8 frantic 24-hour days, and excavation was completed. Now they had to move the boat to treat it in a controlled environment. Here was the problem they faced. The craft's wooden timbers were thoroughly waterlogged. This meant that the cellular material inside the wood cells had been replaced with water to the degree that the wood was now 80% water and had the consistency of wet cardboard. Any evaporation of water from such wood is extremely dangerous, causing the cell walls to collapse. This process is irreversible. The wood shrinks and fragments, and it cannot be restored to its former structure. Because of such dangers during the excavation, We sprayed the boat with water day and night, and even covered it with wet sponges and polyethylene sheets, in addition to shading it from direct sunlight. Fortunately, there was a museum nearby that could accommodate the boat at Kibbutz Ginosar, and it was just over a quarter mile from the site. But moving the boat at all, even 3 feet, was a huge challenge. They were dealing with a 26-foot-long boat, huge and heavy, and it was a wooden boat with every part of it having the consistency of wet cardboard. And worst of all, nothing like this had ever been done before. There were no experts to consult and no precedents to follow. They had to make it up as they went along. They began by placing fiberglass strips contoured to the hull. For the outside, they had to dig tunnels at intervals along the hull to insert the strips. Next came plastic sheeting over and under the craft. And finally, they sprayed on a thick layer of polyurethane foam to completely enclose it. Waxman says, by the end of the process, the entire boat, without having been moved or shifted, had been wrapped in a protective cocoon that looked somewhat like an overgrown melted marshmallow. They cut through the dike, and the marshmallow was ready to sail. And once at the museum, they could start the long work of getting it ready to display. First, they used a large crane to lift the thing into the tank they had built for the preservation process. Then came the laborious task of removing all the polyurethane and filling the tank with water. But not just water. Waxman tells us of the next critical step. A synthetic wax called PEG, polyethylene glycol, will be added to the water in slowly increasing concentrations. Simultaneously, the temperature of the water will be gradually raised. In this way, the PEG will penetrate the cellular cavities of the deteriorated wood and replace the water in the cells. At the conclusion of this years-long process, we will be able to exhibit the boat outside the conservation pool and study it in a dry environment. 7 years later, it was possible to remove the boat from the tank, complete the last steps of conservation, and study it in preparation for opening it to the public. But before the grand opening, small groups were allowed to come and view this last work in progress. Waxman tells of a grandmotherly person who gazed reverently at the boat, asking, "Can I touch it?" He replied, "No, it is still very fragile, and you could damage it." "Have you touched it?" she asked. "Yes, as I work on it." Then the lady responded, "Then can I touch you?" This work required them to know as much as possible about the original appearance of the boat. They were fortunate that there was a mosaic of such a boat in the ancient synagogue at Migdal, reputed home of Mary Magdalene. At first they thought that there would be 6 rowers, but closer examination showed that the oar at right was for the helmsman to steer. So, a crew of 5. Mentions of such boats in Josephus, a Jewish historian of that time, showed that it would be able to accommodate about 15. As a fishing vessel, it would have had a platform at the stern for towing nets. This was the favored method of fishing, and we recall Jesus' words. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net which was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into vessels, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous. There would have been a large rock called the Pillow as ballast to keep the boat in trim. That's mentioned in Mark's account. And a great storm of wind arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the pillow. And they woke him and said to him, "Master, do you not care if we perish?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Then they compiled the clues for dating the vessel. The pottery they had found, combined with carbon-14 dating of the wood and examination of the construction style, all were consistent with a date of late 1st century BC to the mid-1st century AD, encompassing then the time of Jesus and the apostles. Different types of wood present showed that it had been repaired frequently over its lifetime. And finally, after almost 10 years of its discovery, the boat could be put on display. Christians, especially who come to view, will think of this passage from Matthew's Gospel. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. And they will wonder whether what they were seeing was that very boat. It's probably best to say there were many such boats in Jesus' day. It's unlikely that we chanced upon the very one he used. But like this? Surely. What they found confirms the Bible account. And we owe this all to Shelley Waxman, his team, and the volunteers, and perhaps to the providence of God. After all, it began with a dry spell in Galilee in the late 80s. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. 4 at yahoo.com.